Okay, all right. So, yeah.
Oh, I'm short. Okay. Gotta move this. Alrighty. So today, Travis and I are going to be talking about our perspectives on PFAS in due diligence. And there's going to be some common themes that maybe you have heard, but we're hoping to offer you a different perspective. And so I'm going to quickly just highlight a bunch of different questions and considerations that you might want to think about during each phase of a due diligence and redevelopment project. And then he and I are each going to walk through a hypothetical case study where we kind of think through those challenges based on some assumptions. So starting with just a big overview of the considerations, this first slide is what we are considering the pre-acquisition phase. So there's a lot of different questions on this slide. I'm not going to read all of them. And then the three that are bolded are what Travis is going to focus on during his hypothetical case study. But there are, a lot of other good questions to think about during this pre-acquisition phase. So that's like phase 1, phase 2. And then maybe you've decided to move forward with the acquisition, and now you're in the post-acquisition but pre-construction planning phase. Here are some other considerations and questions. Just in the interest of time, we're not going to really dive into these too much. They do have some overlap in the first phase as well as the next phase, but sort of being intentional with your planning considerations going into it is really helpful to understand risk tolerance, worker safety, potential exposure, things like that. And then this last phase, we're calling the design and construction phase. So after Travis walks through his hypothetical case study, I'll talk through a hypo for a redevelopment, and then the three bullets that are bolded are what I'm really going to focus on too. But then again, there's some other good considerations that are, have some PFAS-specific concerns that might be a little bit different than redeveloping other types of contaminated sites. So with that brief intro, I will pass it off to Travis.
All right, thanks Olivia. Thanks, everyone. Great to be here. Real pleasure. Which button? Is it the green one that goes ahead? Okay, there you go. And what goes back? The red one? Okay, got it. All right. Sorry, great to be here. My name is Travis Hearne. I'm an environmental attorney at Mechanik, Nuccio. I work out of Tampa, and our world is, as many of you know, probably the world of real estate. We do transactions for properties that are going to be redeveloped. So our clients are buyers and sellers of sites that have an issue. They're looking for lending. They want to understand the regulatory procedure and what that looks like. Because obviously our clients are on a lot of times very long time frames. They could have we have contracts with a 5-year inspection period, so after that, then you can get a closing, then there's 3 years of permitting, and then there's 5 years of construction. So, people really have to be able to look out in the future and say, what is the regulatory status of things going to be, in 15 years when this development we built is now in the market for sale. So, we've talked about that's kind of how these regulatory things, can really have long-term impacts in planning and development, which is, part of what makes all the due diligence investigations, of course, very important things to look at. And, back to touching on something that Nick was saying, the ASTM Phase 1 standards hinge on whether a constituent is a hazardous substance. So there was, and I think I have this in another slide. Wait till I get to that slide. Not I'll come back. So, but long story short is that the Phase 1s. Let me start over here. A few years ago, there was a question we had, which is, should we sample for PFAS? PFAS is kind of quasi-regulated. It's regulated in this aspect and not that aspect, and we had all these kinds of ambiguities and gray areas around it. But honestly, with the designation of it as a hazardous substance under CERCLA, it really kind of puts to bed the question, really, because that's the presence of hazardous substances is the purpose of the investigation. So, generally, our advice now is it's treated like other hazardous substances, and it's in a lot of cases be good to know it's there, but of course, everything hinges on the Phase 1, right? So when the Phase 1 comes back, if the Phase 1 indicates some reason to think there's a source or there was a release of PFAS there or something like that happened, then if you're buying the property, you want to understand that. So the Phase 1s will be looking for these have to be looking for these types of historical land uses that could be connected with PFAS. And we've seen several of these sites coming through in the last few years. A lot of sites that were wastewater spray fields. So, fires, those kinds of things. And then, really the question that we sort of end up with really is, what is the standard? What is the standard going to be? Because if we're going to clean the site up, we got to know what standard we're going to use to clean the site up. And of course, that's a big part of the conversation at this conference is trying to forecast the standards, because of course we have, there's been a lot of discussion around these things so far. We have the EPA maximum contaminant levels, and then EPA also has screening levels for CERCLA sites, and then DEP has provisional cleanup target levels that were set in 2018. So, regional screening levels are not like, they're not like a CTL. They're used kind of primarily in federal sites to kind of determine what, the direction to take testing. Their screening is, you can think of as, a broader, more general kind of a term. So they don't have the force or the use as a CTL. And then MCL's maximum contaminant levels, those are sourced from the Safe Drinking Water Act, and they're groundwater standards. So, while these things circle around something like a CTL, none of them really is a CTL. So that's what we have that's a CTL is the DEP CTL, the provisional CTL, which currently there are sites being assessed, being remediated, being closed using those provisional CTLs. Okay. And then that ASTM, the newest ASTM guidance has a footnote that talks about emerging contaminants, and basically says emerging contaminants would be treated, if they're not hazardous substances, they could be treated as a business environmental risk. But to the extent that they constitute a hazardous substance, then they can, presence or likely presence of them there would constitute a wreck. So then this is DEP's provisional cleanup target levels, which, as everyone knows, are much higher than the EPA standards. DEP obviously has been taking the position that they're enforceable. The original CTLs are authorized under DEP's enabling statute and under DEP's rules. So these are kind of what's being worked with right now. A lot of the sites were in SIS sites, were kind of former fire sites and things like that, and they've been using these standards to do site assessment and everything like that. So, of course, this is the statute. I'm sure this has come up, in the sessions before. So, DEP passed this statute that basically says, and there's kind of some ambiguity in this statute that I like to just put it out to the room for general consideration. But basically, so the statute says that if EPA hasn't finalized its quote standards for PFAS in drinking water, groundwater, and soil, so right away I have the question: what is this? What standard would this be? Would this be an RSL? Would this be an MCL? What is the standard that the statute is envisioning? Seems kind of unclear to me. And then it says if EPA hasn't finalized those standards by the first of this year, then DEP will have to go through a rulemaking process to create CTLs for PFAS, which then have to be ratified by the legislature. And I heard, Jorge was speaking about it some this morning, have some kind of rumors, but to my knowledge, that's kind of just no action has been taken on that yet. But we anticipate some action to be taken on that. What action, I guess we'll know when we see. But in the interim, until DEP goes through rulemaking and sets those standards, and then those standards are ratified by the legislature, there's this shield for public, certain kinds of entities, specifically public entities and private water suppliers, where DEP is kind of prevented from enforcing its PFAS standards against those specific types of entities, but not other types of entities. So the statute doesn't provide protection for other types of entities than governmental entities and private water suppliers. So, DEP is, out there and can send you a letter and tell you that you have to conduct a PFAS cleanup. So this is kind of just a list of some of the types of land uses and things that are associated historically with PFAS that we've been talking about in this conference, and talking about sites that have all these problems. For us, the sites we've mainly seen that are good redevelopment sites that have PFAS issues, or wastewater spray fields a lot of the time. And this could be domestic or industrial wastewater spray fields, which are often, a lot of times their location isn't too bad. They might be, because the wastewater infrastructure is near possibly urban areas and that kind of thing, but you have these large areas of land where they were spraying the water, so they're kind of, attractive parcels for redevelopment in a lot of cases. So if your phase one brings back historical uses on the site that are these types of uses, or uses associated with PFAS contamination, then your phase two should investigate whether there's any PFAS from those uses left on the site. And then really kind of what we're seeing now is once we can settle on the standard, and that's another question that comes up that I don't know there's an answer to right now, is we have seen sites right now that we're about to put DRC. We're about to conditionally close sites with PFAS contamination using institutional controls, and then if that site is closed under the existing provisional CTL, and then the rulemaking procedure occurs, and there's a new CTL, there will be a question about reopeners that everyone will be asking, is this, you closed under the old standard, do you have to reopen it and close it under the new standard? So that'll be, I think, a question for people. But otherwise, what we've seen is that PFAS, at this point now, it's looking more like it's like other contaminants and it's like other things. So when our clients come to us and say, well, we have this phase 2 and it shows that there's PFAS here, how is this different from other things? And I would say, and sort of a note of optimism, it's becoming more like other things. So we say we can use conditional closure, we can use institutional controls, we can assess the plumes. I really think our main kind of issue or problem around PFAS, the risk that we identify the most for our clients is just the possibility of very large offsite plumes. Because PFAS being such a mobile constituent and that kind of thing, that's one of the risks that we're afraid of. Is that like we have one site a client was looking at, and it's got they got wells, and they got one well right on the border of the property. The groundwater flows right off the edge of the property, and that well has a really hot PFAS hit. So we've got to tell them, well, it's we don't know. We have very limited information to understand if this is plume in right at the property boundary, or does it go for 5 miles off site? So those are the kind of risks that are important to us, but we're starting to see sites getting solved and getting done. So that's kind of right. I think that's it. That's okay. Your turn now, right? Okay, I think that's my last slide. Yeah. Okay. I'm back to my first slide. My first slide. There you go. There you go.
Okay, so I am going to talk about considerations during the design and construction phase. So that would be redeveloping a PFAS impacted site. So let's say for this hypothetical, we're trying to redevelop a former disposal area. We did our phase 1, our phase 2. We detected that there were PFAS concentrations. I've made up some average concentrations that we might see in soil and groundwater. Because it's a former disposal area, likely we're going to have other COCs as well, not just PFAS, that might need to be taken into consideration during redevelopment. And then also, let's say we have a shallow water table. So if we're doing construction, likely dewatering is going to be required at some point. So with this, what are some potential transport and exposure pathways for PFAS? And this slide outlines some of those pathways in both soil and groundwater. And in this hypothetical, we have relatively low concentrations in the grand scheme of PFAS sites. They're above FDEP's provisional criteria, so leachability criteria for soil and provisional groundwater cleanup target levels, but not anything like too crazy. And a lot of these questions and pathways are not PFAS specific. They would be things that we should be thinking about in redeveloping any contaminated site. But there are some things that are more sort of nuanced for PFAS. And so I'm going to focus on 2 of those for the rest of the presentation. How PFAS might impact stormwater runoff, and then is there a potential exposure risk if dust is generated? And so stormwater is a little bit tricky because there's not good literature or research on attributing concentrations in runoff based on a total soils concentration. So if you get rainfall and runoff, and you have a soil concentration that exceeds the leachability criteria, like what kind of stormwater concentration might you see? There's not good data to say, it's going to be within this range. So that makes it a little bit more challenging during decision making. And then fugitive dust, that's a potential exposure risk both for people who are working at the site, but also the surrounding community. And that's something that potentially could be driven by public perception more than risk. And so just thinking through some of that as well. So I'm going to start, I guess before I get into it a little bit more, here are the specific questions that I'm going to walk through today. So for stormwater and dewatering, if you know you have PFAS in those media, what do you have to treat to? What might your discharge limits be? And then given that redevelopment projects are often short-term, what kind of common sense approaches can we use to actually treat PFAS and other contaminants during redevelopment? And then again, with fugitive dust, what's the potential exposure risk to various stakeholders? So I'm going to start with discharge limits. Like many things with PFAS, but especially in stormwater and in NPDES permits, there's not rigid guidance, and there's not guidance in Florida, but also not at the federal level. So I've outlined some possible discharge limits that you might have on a permit. DEP has surface water screening levels. Those were on one of the slides that Travis walked through. That's just for PFOS and PFOA. Similarly, DEP's provisional GCTLs are also only for PFOS and PFOA, but if you're discharging to a surface water body, is comparing it to a provisional groundwater standard really relevant or applicable? And then of course there's the really low numbers that EPA has in drinking water, but again, are those the most relevant? Is the surface water body being used for drinking water at some point downstream? And then there's even more PFAS, that would need to be considered, not just PFOS and PFOA. Last year, there were aquatic life criteria that were proposed. That was for 10 different PFAS, and they were intended to be used so that state agencies and tribal entities could establish discharge limits and NPDES permits. And their range of concentrations were in milligrams per liter, which for PFAS, that's actually pretty high. But with the administration change, the final review at EPA was paused. So those criteria are kind of in limbo at the moment. And then two other options that are not as straightforward but could be calculated are permit-specific criteria using risk assessment based on the site and the specific receptors around it. And then you could look at background concentrations and compare your discharge concentrations to those to maybe demonstrate that you're not contributing additional PFAS to a surface water body. And so if you're going to treat a mix of groundwater and stormwater, there's kind of two main buckets. There's an active treatment system, which is traditionally what we think about when we think about dewatering treatment. And then there's passive treatment, which is what we typically think about with stormwater treatment. And so when you combine those two things together and are trying to use one treatment option, it can become challenging. Capturing stormwater across a large construction site to treat it at a specific system, that sounds difficult. There's a lot more design that goes into that. The rental equipment, depending on the length of your project, that could add cost. But passive systems usually have flow limitations. So if you're combining flows from dewatering and surface water to treat them through a passive BMP, then you might not have the proper residence time or a large enough footprint to be able to implement a passive BMP. And then you have to be a little bit more intentional about designing it for effluent monitoring. And then of course, all of those things can be complicated by suspended solids as well as other contaminants, because again, we're talking about redeveloping a PFAS contaminated site. Okay, so pivoting a little bit to talk about dust. There is a potential exposure pathway for PFAS in dust by the potential to ingest or inhale dust during work if the dust has PFAS on it. So what you can do is use some risk assessment to calculate soil screening levels. Those are calculated using specific exposure assumptions that are based on your site, and then you use reference doses that are available through EPA to be able to calculate a soil screening level for a specific contaminant. And then you would compare your site-specific data to that screening level, and if it exceeds it, then that means that it's likely that there is a potential risk of exposure, and if it's well below that, then it's unlikely that there would be a human health risk if ingested during construction. So this slide has two values that we recently calculated for a project where we were going to be doing soil movement. We calculated soil screening levels for PFOA and PFOS only because those were what were relevant to our project site. And then we used EPA's 2024 oral reference doses for those two analytes. So the rounded values from that calculation are on this slide. And as you can see, they're above DEP's provisional leachability criteria, but below their direct exposure residential. So, I mean, that's like a reasonable number to potentially be screening your sites against. But when comparing your site-specific data, it's important to look at an average concentration on an exposure-wide basis, not necessarily the highest concentration, because that's not fully representative of what a potential exposure risk would be. So you'd want to do something like a 95% UCL calculation. And if you did happen to exceed that soil screening level, then you could take it a step further and prepare dust monitoring plan, and that would involve some real-time numbers for screening and then taking some lab samples to confirm in real time. But frankly, just using traditional wetting is pretty good at limiting dust emissions. So while the calculations seem like a little fancy, actually in practice, we're already doing things that would mitigate that risk. So it's not as complicated maybe as it seems at the surface. Okay, so going back to the hypothetical case study, looking at these made up numbers, is stormwater a potential transport pathway? Maybe, but again, like I mentioned, there's not good literature to really know, so it should be evaluated. Is dewatering treatment needed based on these made-up concentrations? Most likely, but it really depends on your effluent limits, which get negotiated with the regulatory agency issuing the permit. And then is fugitive dust an exposure pathway with this hypothetical? Not likely, but it's best to confirm by calculating an exposure-wide concentration. One more? Okay, so the last slide is just some takeaways from the things that Travis and I talked about. We just want to emphasize that it's really important to consider risk tolerance during each phase of redevelopment. If you are performing phase 2 sampling, similar with any contaminant, we shouldn't forget all of our good, best consulting practices just because it says PFAS. So we should be focused and thoughtful and intentional about where we're sampling. Regulations for PFAS and stormwater are still evolving, but there are challenges that can be overcome with experienced Clean Water Act practitioners and stormwater engineers, and then just reminding folks that sometimes public perception can impact your decision making. So it might not just be risk-based, it could also have some sort of perception that ties into it. And that is all I got. Thank you.
All right, so yeah, we'll